I'd like to give a few comments, first of all, on the way in which we're discussing this matter. We're raising the question because it's a very complicated issue, but the way that we're asking the questions is not necessarily a given, as in stating that we can't have an energy transition or environmental transition without taking into account social issues. We don't say the opposite. However, there is a fundamental principle to environmental policies. It's the idea of integration. It's not mentioned often enough. It's that environmental policies need to be integrated in other public policies, and very few symposiums focus on, in particular in France, on how you take into account the environment in social policies. And so the day in which we'll see as many symposiums on that reversed question will be an interesting day, because there are environmental considerations that need to be taken into account in social policies. For example, well, we talk about social justice, and we don't often enough talk of the environmental efficiency of social policies. And since we do talk about all of these issues, we do consider them enough. It's just that we need to reverse the question sometimes. Energy transition policies, environmental transition policies must be socially just. That raises two questions. That's a problem when we don't state this principle for other public policies, for example, national defense or foreign policy, tourism policy, foreign trade policy, domestic trade policy. You need to justify it, therefore. Secondly, all public policy has one initial aim, and the environmental policy's primary aim, is to protect the environment, which may involve anti-social measures or anti-freedom measures. For example, setting speed limits on roads and saying that we'll check them much more efficiently by way of speedometers, and this is one of the measures that's most contributed towards reducing energy use and CO2 emissions. It's a restriction of personal freedom, and yet it's very much accepted. Second comment. This was mentioned by Aldo, among others. All carbon tax needs to be compensated. And attempts at introducing carbon tax in France, the controversy often affected how the tax was compensated for. And it's an issue that's constantly raised when you talk about green taxes, but not when you talk about other types of tax. For example, when a tax in other sectors, in other fields, or new taxes are created, we don't talk about compensation. So one should ask, so maybe that the green taxation is reaching a point where obligatory taxation is already at a high level. For example, you can already see that in the HGV tax. It's a new tax that has caused a lot of problems. And also the problem comes from the fact that the chosen tax in the green tax is indirect taxation, which is not as progressive as direct taxation. Third comment is that is energy transition, as suggested in the title of the symposium, will it increase inequality and tension between employment, competitiveness, and purchasing power? I'd like to remind you, because it's not necessarily always very well known, that the increase in energy poverty, which is undeniable in France and other countries, is not caused by increases in energy prices. Between 1960 and 2003, the average cost of fuel in France has decreased by 10%, so we're paying less for fuel now than in 1960, and household revenue has been increased by 3. So in terms of constant euros, purchasing power has increased. Electricity costs for households between 1987 and 2007 decreased by 37%, the cost of gas by 25%, and the cost of fuel by 6%. So maybe energy poverty is increasing, but not because of of a rise in energy costs. So energy is so energy poverty, is it due to taxation of energy? No, because there's a decrease in tax on energy in EU countries over the past 20 years, especially in France. To give you a few figures, in 1998 and 2009, energy tax represented 1.97 of the GDP percent, and 2.1% in the EU. In France, and in 2009, it's 1.45%, and it's 1.8% in the EU. So the average in the EU has decreased. So there was practically no gap, and there's now a 0.3 gap in energy taxation in France compared to the EU. With regard to obligatory taxation, energy tax is part of direct taxation a bit more. It used to be 4.5% in 1998 in France. In the EU, it was 5.2%. In 2009, it's 3.5% in France and 4.7% in the EU, i.e. a gap of 1.2. So the decrease has been much swifter in France. Just to remind us of something you might have forgotten, up to 1986 in France, the purchase of a car came together with a 33% VAT rate, as it was considered a luxury good. It's now taxed at a VAT level, the standard VAT level, and that decrease on the tax on purchasing vehicles was not compensated by an increase in taxation on their use. So will the policies increase inequality? We'd remind you there are many mechanisms in France that take into account the social aspects of energy policy. There's regulated tariffs, social tariffs, which were extended to various types of people. They'll be replaced by an energy check, reduced VAT on electricity and gas subtraction, and many other measures. Having said that, how can we reform, and what areas of consensus could we use? First of all, there is a triptych I'd like to that I find very important. It's this following chronological triptych. If you want to reform green tax, there are 3 stages to follow. First of all, decrease subsidies and tax credits that harm the environment. So that's mainly subsidies to fossil fuels at present. Secondly, amend the existing taxation system. And thirdly, create new taxes. So reduce subsidies, first of all. Why? Well, because it's a major problem for the vulnerable social categories. That's not the entire picture, because often these subsidies are gained by intermediaries, and secondly, because they're often grabbed by the middle classes rather than the lower classes. So, for example, fuel subsidies, the most vulnerable categories don't have a vehicle, for example, or have fewer vehicles than in the middle classes, and the more you see the situation in developing countries, the more that's the case. And to give you another example, it's full exemption of tax on fuel for the planes. Obviously, the lowest social classes don't take the plane, so it's a subsidy that doesn't help them at all. Then amend the existing tax system. Well, it's because it's less difficult politically than creating a new tax. That was the whole problem with the carbon tax in France. I was asked to speak on this matter. I was not in favor of how the bill, Sarkozy's bill, was prepared, and I had recommended at the time to amend a different type of tax rather than introduce a new one. And finally, that was voted in by Parliament this year, and that's much more accepted because it's not considered a new tax. The same thing for diesel. We often talk about how it's underpriced. The problem is not from it being less taxed than petrol, it's the gap, it's the difference between the two, and that difference can be resolved in three ways. Either decrease tax on petrol, increase tax on diesel, or do a bit of both. Another area of consensus so, for example, increasing fuel costs are much more efficient in the long term than in the short term. There's a difference between measures, how good they are according to which time frame you're looking at them. We also need to consider attenuation, as we call it in France. It's to reduce fees for energy, or remove taxes for certain social categories, or according to different levels. So the perverse effect of this is that it's okay on a social level, but there's no message that's being given to the people on an environmental level. And so that's often the problem with social tariffs. Compensation is different. Everyone pays the same price, but we compensate by giving funds. That's also a good social measure, but there's no message that's being passed on. These people can spend the money they like on what they like, but they can also take measures to improve their energy efficiency. So the most recent reform bill is completely different from the one attempted 2 years ago, and I think it'll be a good one because we're going to have a system of energy checks. To conclude, forecastability and efficiency of the measures. We saw an excellent example from Sweden. We're not doing the same in France. In 2012, we decided to decrease tax by 0.3 cents on fuel. And obviously, the loss of tax revenue was terrible, so we removed that tax deduction, which had a terrible effect overall. So to provide prior knowledge to people is very important because it can help the industry, help company owners, and so on. So I have two comments now. Social measures in developed countries can have a detrimental effect to developing countries, especially the poorest in those countries. So if you want to take into account social justice, you need to take into account the global picture. So the energy check extension to fuel, which is part of the bill that's being presented to Parliament, is socially just for the most vulnerable categories, but it's disastrous to those categories in developing countries because it encourages CO2 emissions, which will affect those countries much more than us because they are much more feeling the effects of climate change. Finally, have a broad vision. I think taking into account social issues in a single sectoral policy can have a negative impact on economic and social and environmental aspects. So, for example, the housing policy in France with various taxes and lack of enlightened investment has increased the phenomenon of urban sprawl, which has a terrible effect socially speaking, because it leads certain categories to have much longer journeys to cover. It's also very negative in terms of CO2 emissions and also from an environmental perspective. Thank you.